Hey everybody, welcome inside another edition of the Mortgage Impact Podcast. My name is Jen Bates, Communications Manager at Movement Mortgage. And I know we say this a lot, we're very excited to have people on, but I'm extremely thrilled to have these two guests on with us today. You guys know friend of the show, Montell Watson, the Director of Movement Direct at Movement Mortgage, but also the leader of the Black American Homeownership Initiative and the advisory group within Movement Mortgage. We're also joined today by Alanna McCargo, who's the Vice President for Housing Finance Policy at the Urban Institute. Alanna, I'm so excited to have you on today because we've wanted to have you on for so long because you are such an important voice in what's going on. So thank you for being on here this morning.
It's so great to be with you both.
Awesome. Alanna, tell us a little bit more about you. We know a lot about Montell. We've had him on plenty of times. I want to know more about you, your background, and how you got to work for the Urban Institute.
Sure. So Alanna McCargo with the Urban Institute. I am the Vice President of our Housing Finance Center. And I have been with the Urban Institute for about 4.5 years. I have a long career though in housing finance, mortgage lending, and real estate. Over 25 years. I won't date myself too much here with you guys, but I've been doing this for a really long time. I was previously in policymaking roles at Fannie Mae, which is a big housing finance agency you guys know about, I'm sure. I worked for a big data company and did a lot of data insights work, CoreLogic, which is really a big engine behind a lot of the mortgage business. I spent some time at JPMorgan Chase. We won't talk about them, and have been doing this working in this space in this field for a long time, trying to really help on the more so on a policy side, and have really brought that to Urban to really amplify research work and sort of evidence base that can really help with policymaking.
An incredible background, actually, just a wealth of knowledge in the housing space. And guys, if you haven't checked out the Urban Institute's website, it's urban.org. You can sign up for newsletters, and it's not just housing they talk about all sorts of different research on age, on health, on crime. Incredible research to be found on that site. They have newsletters you can sign up for with specific topics if you're interested. Again, urban.org. And Montell, you and I were talking before we got on this recording about the latest research that came out in the beginning of June from Alanna. The article is called How Economic Crises Increase Racial Disparities in Home Ownership. And I think that's a big topic that we need to talk about today. And Montell, we have a lot of research about that. I'm going to sit back and let you guys discuss this topic.
Yeah.
If we wanted to, we could break this down and take 6 months having this discussion, right? And still not hit everything. So what are the most—
Probably 600 years. It's a big topic.
Yeah,
big topic.
Incredibly important topic. So what strikes you about that? What's important for you right now, Montell?
Well, first and foremost, before I answer that, thank you so much, Alanna, for jumping on with us. I greatly appreciate you. Every single time I talk to Alanna, I promise you I learned something. She's going to start charging me every single time I talk to her because I am learning something consistently and always asking her so many questions. But yes, absolutely. Yes, big topic, big, huge topic. And man, so we've all known that we've had housing issues. And if you haven't, I encourage people, go out, do research, learn about it, right? Because it's very important as we continue to deal with racial issues in the country today, right? The Color of Law is a fantastic resource. Alanna, fantastic resource at the Urban Institute. So do your research, right, and learn. I think it's very important. But as we look at the current crisis, people of color are typically hit the hardest, right? Whenever we approach these different crises because of different variables, whether it's income inequality. I think that the unemployment rate came out a week or so ago, and it fell a little bit from like around 14.7, which was like the highest since the Great Depression, right? And people of color are typically outpacing, white people in regards to unemployment. So these type of things have large effects on of housing for people of color, right? And along with that, like Alanna, I would love to know, as you've done research on, you know, the Great Depression, research on what's going on today with the pandemic. Let's talk a little bit about how those two compare, and specifically for people of color.
Yeah, so thank you for that. That was a great, just sort of a backdrop there. We've been thinking a lot about how this pandemic, which is a public health crisis, right? One that has told us from the beginning, like, stay at home and shelter in place. How that health crisis has quickly became an economic crisis that required us to be in our house. And the connection of that to this whole issue of homeownership and housing stability and everything else is just so crystallized in this moment as we are facing this health crisis around the world. And this is different in so many ways, and that's really the fundamental one. And the reason why housing becomes so front and center in this is because this has been about staying at home. Staying at home and staying, away from people and socially distancing. And you need to have that resource to be able to be safe. And that's just so real for everybody right now. So then you think about all of the people that don't have housing. You know, we've got many people, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets that are homeless in our country. We've got people that are living in very dense and unsafe housing, and you've got situations where people now have lost their jobs and are having a really difficult time paying their biggest obligation every month, which is the rent or the mortgage. So to be facing this, I got the government and everybody, my governor, my mayor telling me stay at home. My job is shut down. My cash flow has ended. And now I'm being told to stay at home, and I can't even pay for the house I need to stay in. Just the absolute burden on people is it's the most serious that we've seen in our lifetimes in terms of duress and just complete stress on every aspect of people's lives. So when you think about where we are now with this pandemic and the economic downturn that has followed, and we're essentially in a recession right now, we look at the unemployment rates that you mentioned, Montell. I mean, it's great. I mean, it's great to see that there's it looks like week over week, a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel when you look at the national numbers. But when you look and break down the unemployment rate by race, very different story. And so, so I want to talk a little bit about that as we get into this today, because the black unemployment rate is over 16.5%. The Hispanic unemployment rate is even higher than that. And that's just the nature of the industries that have been most impacted by this crisis. So I say all that to say, and just sort of do the comparison, when you look at what happened during the Great Recession in 2008, there were a whole different set of dynamics in play running up to that situation. We were going through a real housing boom in the early 2000s, right? Home prices were on the rise. And then we were seeing a lot more people of color getting access to mortgages. Unfortunately, they weren't great products and great mortgages. They weren't safe mortgages. But we were seeing sort of an economic boom happening leading up to, if you look at 2006 and 2005 and 2006. In 2007, things really started to get unstable in the housing markets and in the capital markets. And what we started to see was a lot of defaults on the mortgages that were risky and not very good mortgage products as people were buying their homes at the height of the market. And then we saw a major collapse happen and home prices fell immediately in 2008. And then all of a sudden, people who had just bought homes, you know, bought a $400,000 home, saw that home's price go down to $200,000. And so they were totally over leveraged, had negative equity. And then people were not able to pay and keep up with those mortgage agreements and obligations. And we started to see that wave of defaults happen. You know, and we saw unemployment strike at that time as well. We saw, you know, people you know, losing income. We saw just banks shutting down, going out of, we saw financial institutions going out of business just overnight, big ones. And consolidation was happening. I mean, it was a very, very difficult time. And that crisis just was so different. And the biggest differences that I can think of just off the bat were home prices declined rapidly. People were automatically in default. And then we just didn't really have the system and the structure in place to think about, well, what do we do with all these loans that are defaulting? What are the mortgage servicing options and loss mitigation options, foreclosure prevention options? And it was just sort of, you were in the midst of this crisis and all this wave of defaults was coming at us. And at the time I worked at Fannie Mae, and we were in the center of that discussion and trying to figure out how to stop that wave that was just crushing institutions and crushing our system, and putting families on the street because they were not able to make those payments, and there was no options in play to help them stay in their homes. So we've come a long way from what happened in 2008. This crisis began with immediate action by the federal agencies, by the federal government, Fannie and Freddie. Everybody came out very quickly with foreclosure moratoriums. There will be no foreclosures. FHFA just this morning announced they're extending that. It initially was through the end of June, now it's through the end of August. No evictions, no foreclosures. And then the CARES Act, Congress acted very quickly and put what is called the CARES Act in place. And that provided relief for people that have mortgages, and essentially gave them the option to go into forbearance and not make those payments for a period of time while we go through this crisis. So we didn't have those mechanisms in place in 2008 when we faced this. So the good news is, going into this particular situation, there has been there are tools in place to work through this that were not there before. So we're not seeing this rapid default crisis happen. We are not seeing home prices drop, you know, but by looking like anything we saw in 2008. And we have plans and programs in place to help people stay current on their mortgages and not go into delinquency right away. They're going to have to work through that. That's the tail end of this. We're going to have to work through how those payments get caught up and what loss mitigation options people go into afterwards. But we do have tools in play and a lot of conversations underway about how to address what's coming ahead of us.
Absolutely. It's interesting because my first job out of college was subprime lending. I jumped right into it. First job, had no idea what I really was doing, right? But you learn really quickly. I learned really quickly, and I knew that I needed to get out of it. So it's interesting to be a part of it during that time, and then where we are today, and seeing. I agree completely. There was quick action. I know that here at Movement, things were moving so fast, and I know for a lot of lenders, as all those things were changing daily, it felt like some type of change was coming, and you had to be mobile, you had to be adaptive and ready to continue to move, right? So yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do in the housing industry, right, to help improve the current homeownership gap for people of color. You guys have done some great research on the numbers, why they are where they are, with the homeownership gap of people for Black people in America, as well as Hispanic people in America. So let's just talk a little bit, unpack that. What can we do in the housing industry?
Yeah, so you're hitting. So I'll just real quick say the numbers. right now, and this is a lot of this has to do with what we were just talking about. The Black and Latino households in America during the Great Recession lost a lot of their homeownership gains. Essentially, for the Black community, completely wiped out. All those gains I talked about in the early 2000s wiped out because people were in homeownership and completely lost it during the Great Recession. So what we find today is we have a massive racial homeownership gap you can tie it directly to America's wealth gap, and it is growing. That gap is growing. Right now, it's a 30-point gap between Black Americans and white Americans homeownership rate. 26 or 27-point gap for Hispanic Americans and Black and white Americans. So those gaps are big, and I'll just make this note, particularly on Black homeownership. They're bigger today than they were in 1968 when it was legal to racially discriminate against Black people in terms of buying homes. And so the gap is wider today than it was then. And that's not progress, clearly. And we've had 50 years plus of housing policies and things that have gone into play to help and try to remedy these things, and we're not moving the dial. So I think the situation today is really, it's really dire. And it was dire before the COVID-19 crisis hit. That is just deepening the divide. And so we've got to stay and figure out and stay really focused on how we can make policy that is racially conscious, that really does focus on these racial gaps that have huge consequences for a huge part of our population. I mean, the Latino population is the fastest growing population in this country. And, I'm a believer that when everyone is doing well, we are all good, all of us. And if you've got these disparities and these widening gaps, we're going to continue to have just so many issues. It's taxing, it's expensive, it's not healthy, and we need everybody to be healthy, and we need everybody to have housing. And so I'll just stop there, Montell. But I just wanted to, I think that this is a moment for us to really think about in housing all of the disparities that have been there in the past and how we really can do the work to move forward and make change. And that change is not just federal policy, but state and local policy. It's it's industry, and how does the industry change some of its systems, and how do we think about who we make loans to. We've got a young generation coming up right now. A lot of people graduating from college right now in the COVID era. Jobs are going to be hard to come by. Income, things are getting delayed. So we've got to. All of this has implications for the housing market that are potentially long-term implications that we're going to have to grapple with.
Alanna, I'm going to jump in really quickly if you don't mind, because I really want to expand on those numbers you just had about the 30-point gap. And I'm looking, a lot of people wondering, well, why is that important? Why is that important? Homeownership. It's not just about owning a home, it's about building wealth and building generational
Right.
wealth. And looking at your paper on urban.org, when you look at the home equity and net worth, the disparity between Black and white Americans, which is tied directly to that home ownership, is incredible. The median net worth for white families, over $276,000, whereas for Black families, it's just under $100,000. And that speaks volumes to me, Montell. I know we've talked about tying homeownership and generational wealth is extremely important. So when we talk about these numbers being worse than they were in the civil rights era, that is disturbing numbers, because this is holding back a generation.
No, absolutely. I definitely think it's very difficult to hear those numbers, being a Black male in America, right? One thing that I am very hopeful for is the next generation. And I think that we have an opportunity from an educational standpoint to say, hey, let's get into the education system, right? And start to teach financial literacy. And let's actually spend time with the next generation in marginalized communities to say, hey, let's learn at the core foundational level, and let's teach these very important things that we deal with, right? Understanding your credit, savings, budgets, understanding a car loan, understanding a home loan, like understanding these things at early ages, and understanding credit cards, student loan. Understand all of this stuff at an early age. So when it comes a time for you to make these very important decisions, you're very aware, you understand everything that you're doing. You don't have a 2008 where, people of color are taking loans that they probably shouldn't take, right? I was on the front lines of that, of, giving 10% loans with 100% LTV, like just loans that people should not receive, right?
Yeah.
I think that for the next generation, a lot of what, movement does, and pouring, back into the local communities and the marginalized communities from an education standpoint, I think financial institutions have an opportunity to partner with the education sector and really pour in to the next generation. Another piece I'd like to talk about, Alanna, as we talked about the housing industry, I want to open it up a little bit, because you have a 5-point framework. Do you mind just touching on that a little bit, of what it could look like for us in the future, not only for the housing industry, but policy, et cetera? Just touch on your 5-point framework on how we can move forward from the homeownership gaps for Black Americans.
Definitely. One point I did want to mention too, just to on Jennifer's point, we have, so if you think about the fact that Black and Latino families, the Black homeownership rate has never hit 50% in this country, ever. So that means we are, Black and Latino families are a huge portion of the renter population. That's how their housing is tied up, that's what their housing is today. Just to get back to your question about the wealth connection, just because I want to put just a point on that, it's so important. Most of the people, Montell, that you're talking about in terms of serving and how the mortgage industry is serving, these are going to be, especially if they're Black and brown people, first generation, first-time home buyers. And probably because we know that the vast majority of Black and brown people rent, their parents and families may not have a legacy of home ownership. And so that, without that legacy of ownership and asset and appreciation and being able to build that equity, to Jennifer's point that we put out in the paper, it is disproportionately, if you're Black or Latino and you have any wealth, the majority of that wealth comes from your home equity. Over 55% for Black families, over 60% for Latino families. It is huge. And that is why it's just so critical to understand why people have these initiatives for Black homeownership, initiatives for Hispanic homeownership, because that is the critical way to build wealth for the long term and have wealth to pass on to your family, so that your children and grandchildren can get down payment assistance from you, and you have assets to be able to pass on to them. And that is the crux of this, and the dream that everybody is chasing after, and we've got to put that back on equal footing. And if we can get the home ownership rate on equal footing, and we can really work and fix that, we can get these wealth gaps to start breaking down. So I just wanted to make that point. So Montell, back to the 5-point framework. Sorry to divert, but you know my passion. You know my passion on these issues. It's so important. But the 5-point framework is something actually that. I love it. Yeah. So we, last year, the Urban Institute, with a number of partners, we actually collaborated on something called the Black Homeownership Roundtable, and we put together what we called a 5-point framework for reducing the Black homeownership gap. You guys can find that on our website. There's a whole paper, but there's also a nice document that just sort of summarizes the 5-point plan and some of the things that could happen underneath that plan that would really advance and help reduce these gaps that we've been talking about. I'll just really quickly go through the 5-point framework. The focus that the group came together with, and this is not just urban researchers, but we had civil rights organizations, we had mortgage lenders, we had policymakers, we had real estate brokers. So we had a number of different people at the table talking through the biggest challenges and the biggest barriers for people of color to become homeowners, and this is kind of what we came up with. So foundational to the 5-point plan are two things. We talk about fair housing and fair lending. So, this is the structural things that you were talking about earlier, Montell. Foundational to all of this plan is ensuring that we have a structure that is non-discriminatory. And I'll just give you quick examples. It means that people, no matter who they are, if they want to look at homes and potentially see if they can qualify for one, they're not, real estate agents show them the homes in all neighborhoods, and there's access and accessibility to all of that. And there's no discriminatory practices in the real estate arena, just as one example. So the 5-point framework, if you assume that, everything was equal and we could do these things, one of the first things we talk about is actually housing supply and affordability. As you guys know, across the country, home prices have gone up a lot. So going into COVID, we have a very healthy housing market. And housing prices are very stable, and lending products are very safe coming out of the crisis. There's still a lot of really good consumer protections in place and a lot of safe lending going on. So really good situation, but housing prices are really, really high. That means when people need to buy a house, they're having to buy it with much more debt associated with that, bigger mortgages. Even though, interest rates have been at all-time lows for a very long time, and they are as they are right now, that's helped to keep the affordability down, but home prices themselves have really been on the rise pretty much nationwide. So really tackling housing supply, meaning making sure we have a supply of affordable housing, safe, affordable housing in neighborhoods that people can either build or purchase, is critical. So housing supply is kind of the first point in the 5-point framework, and affordability. The second is ensuring we have an equitable and accessible housing finance system. And what I mean by that, just simply, is that all of the mechanisms that are in place behind a person getting a mortgage loan, that's our housing finance system. So from the origination process all the way through to closing the loan, and then that loan gets into gets sold and as it gets into the investor in the capital markets, and then a servicer gets it. All of those mechanisms that support the housing finance system, we need them to be equitable and we need them to be accessible. And we need to make sure that as we look at housing finance reform, which has been a big topic since the last housing crisis, that as we reform these agencies, especially FHA, which is a big source of lending for Black and Latino families, disproportionate source of lending, that we have solid systems in place to support those people and people can get access to those lending programs. And so that's really important. That was point 2. The third point in our plan really talks about advancing policy solutions at the local level, because as we were talking about earlier, a lot of federal policy matters, but what's happening locally and in one's particular market makes all the difference. And really, real estate and housing is local. You guys know that better than I do. You're in this business, and there are barriers, whether it's local zoning laws that are on the books, that have been on the books, that that are, or land use that say you can't build certain kinds of things on this kind of there's a lot of things that are in our history of zoning and local land use, and you talked about redlining earlier. I mean, redlining is a historical thing that really lives in our local policy. So we've really got to look at and focus on this issue, not only at the federal level, because there's not a silver bullet from the federal agencies. We've got to tackle this locally. Number 4, focusing on sustainability of homeownership. And the reason why we have a focus on sustainability is because of this moment we're in right now with COVID. So point 4 is all about keeping people in their homes. So once people achieve homeownership, we've got to make sure there are mechanisms in place to keep them in their homes. When hard times hit, when job loss comes, when you get sick, you need to have a place to go, and you need to have there need to be programs in place to help you get through those moments. We all have ups and downs in our lives. A mortgage is a 30-year commitment. In 30 years, there's going to be some ups and downs, right? Yeah. So it's really important that there is a sustainability factor in play, and this is really important for the vulnerable populations we've been talking about, Black and Latino families who tend to, that we talked about earlier, have just an enhanced and heightened experience when it comes to job loss and all of these things. And we're even seeing, higher death rates in the Black community, for example, from COVID. I mean, those are real things. Things are worse, and we've got to make sure we've got sustainability in place when people reach homeownership. And then the final thing, really important, especially for you and the initiatives that you have underway, is accelerating outreach, housing counseling for renters and mortgage-ready millennials. We have a huge number of renters that are making good money, that are living in markets where it's more affordable to own than it is to rent, but they're still renting. And a lot of millennials that are living in places that and are ready to purchase based on a study we did in 2019 with Freddie Mac, which talked about the mortgage-ready millennial population, the big population that we identified, over 1.2 million Black families and 4.6 million Hispanic millennials who are mortgage ready in cities across the country. And so that outreach, those educational programs you were talking about, making sure people understand homeownership is an option and is available to them, how it works, what they need to do, the fact that they might be able to have a lower monthly payment for 30 years that's locked in if they own that place versus renting, and that payment could actually be lower than what they're paying in rent today. People don't know that. Why don't people know that? And so we need to. That's that's the essence of the 5-point plan. And yes. I think if we really focused and really got deep on each one of those pillars, as an industry, policymakers and others, there's a lot of change that could be made in terms of closing the racial homeownership gap.
No, that is absolutely beautiful. Like as we talked about, it is a huge issue, right? It's a massive issue that takes multiple parties, real estate, policymakers, lenders. Everybody has to come together, be innovative, and be disciplined, and be in it for the long haul. Because this is a issue that we will have to continuously fight. We continuously fight, continuously improve, and innovate on.
Looks like we lost Montell really quickly. We'll get him back in just a second. Alanna, it's the trouble with having kids, I think, and everybody wanting to be on device at the same time, right? But yeah, I think he brings up a great point, and we can start to wrap this up, because again, we could talk about this nonstop, I think. Nonstop. Absolutely. We can talk about this and continue to dive even deeper, because right now we're even at the high level. We don't even have time to dive into each of those topics like you mentioned.
We don't. Yeah. We don't. But I tell you what, I mean, there are a number of resources, and folks watching can go and check out a lot of the papers we talked about, go really deep. And so I think deep into these numbers, deep into the issues, and even some of the information I was sharing about, particularly about mortgage-ready millennials and some of that data. Really, if you live in Houston, or if you live in one of these markets, it's really you can go online and kind of look at things that are more local and really kind of understand what's going on in your market, because it's all real estate is local, as we know. Yeah. Montell, you back?
Yeah, there he is.
Man, I got this dial-up internet out here in the country.
I tell you what, man. Well, hey guys, couple final thoughts. Montell, I know we always want to end it. I know Movement has a very positive, we can make some change outlook on a lot of things. And I want to end that with y'all's thoughts on where do we start? What does that look like for you guys? Where is the hope?
So I want to touch on Alanna's point of the, 1.6 million people of color. Number one, that could own a home that does not right now today. As lenders, we are responsible to reach out to those people, to make them aware that they can own a home the American dream, as you touched on a little bit earlier, Alanna, is still available for them. And it is very important for them to understand the positive aspects of owning a home, right? But man, to end on a positive note, and then I'll kind of pass it over to you for a little bit, Alanna, for this as well. But as we think about how extremely vulnerable people of color are right now today, anytime we go through some type of tragic crisis, it's 2008, as we're dealing with right now with COVID, you know, I think about like, what kind of message would you have for people of color, right? Where a lot of people are hurting financially, you know, health-wise, et cetera. And that message that I have is, man, like my dad taught me at an early age that to believe, right? Believe that whatever it is that you want to do, that you can do, that you can achieve any goal that you put out in front of you. And it first starts with belief, right? And it starts with me inside of my heart and my mind to know that that's available for me. I can get that. I can do that. And having that hope and that belief is the first step. And then being like, having the willingness to say, I'm going to work my ass off. Is it okay to say that on the podcast, Jen? Work my ass off to get to what I want and what I believe I can have. So just a piece of hope and belief for anyone out there that 1.6 million millennials, go get it. Go get it. It is available for you. You can do it, and just believe in it. Alanna.
Well, that is definitely inspiring. Probably a good note. I'll try to stay on the positive because this is really this is like such an important moment. Like I get like a little emotional almost because we are seeing, you know, the country there's just a wave and a transformation, I think, that's happening as a result of the pandemic, as a result of the racial justice movements that are happening right now all across America, all across the world. It is absolutely, you know, just to use the words of you young folks, you know, people are woke, and it's time. Like, I mean, I feel like much of the population has walked around and been awake, you know, and if you are a Black person, Montell, a Black man, a Black woman in this country, you've endured and you understand what your parents have been through, and your history is much more clear to you. And you know, Black people and immigrants, new people arriving in America, they have gotten through every single day based on what you just said, which is just hope and hard work and all of those things. And I think that it's really, we're just at this moment where I agree with you 100%. We need to continue to have hope and faith and continue to be aware, educate ourselves, understand all those things. And we've done that to a large extent, but yet still structures and systems and our legacy continues to hold generations back, hold Black and brown people back. And so we need more than just hope and faith. We need to continue to believe that it is possible, that there will be real change, whether it's federal laws we've talked about, state and local laws we've talked about, you know, new programs, opening up access to credit, whatever those things are. We've got to work to break down those barriers that have persisted for hundreds of years, that have kept Black and Latino people from economic prosperity and economic mobility. And that's, I know my personal responsibilities and my family's responsibilities and my faith and my hope, but even more importantly, is instilling and influencing and talking Montell youth platforms such as this, and educating and informing policymakers, people with power, to actually make change, to think about these disparities we've been talking about when they're making policies and programs, and to make sure they're reaching into those communities that have been disinvested in for so many years, redlined for so many years. So I think I see a lot of opportunity and a lot of hope that these people and these structures and organizations and our government will take this moment of being woke and really help us move this forward and move the dial. And we understand now how fundamental it is for all of our health and safety, that everybody have a place to call home, that everyone has safe shelter, that everyone can afford their monthly payment and aren't burdened by their housing payment. You know, housing is a human right. And we all need to work in that vein and just make sure that we are doing everything in our power to continue to influence and drive that change forward. It's not going to happen without this kind of work and everything you're doing, and that so many more that are out there looking at this video today are working on. So I hope that was positive ending enough.
Absolutely.
Loved it. Alanna, Montell, you guys have been incredible. Thank you for waking up early. We're recording this before 9 a.m. Thank both of you, because this is an extremely important topic. And Alanna, a lot of stuff you talked about. Make sure you check out the show notes, everybody, at mortgageimpactpodcast.com. I'll link you up to the Urban Institute's website, Alanna's research, the 5-point plan, so you guys can dive into it, because it's a responsibility to educate ourselves. And like Montell said, it's our responsibility as a mortgage lender to educate the people around us and make sure that everybody knows and is aware of what's happening in our country. So thank you guys both for taking time, and we'll see you again next time. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alanna.
Take care, guys. Thank you so much. Take care.